Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we dig into complex source material and pull out the most essential and actionable ideas for you, the learner. So let's start with a feeling I think we all know. You're pouring everything you have into a project. You've got the conviction, you have the resources, maybe even a model that worked, brilliantly for years. But now it just feels like you're pushing a rock uphill. The old methods aren't getting the old results. So you try harder, right? You get more organized, but the friction just seems to get worse.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, it's because the most dangerous assumption we see shaping leadership and mission right now, it isn't some big theological error, it's strategic rigidity.
Strategic rigidity.
Yeah, we see it all the time. People mistake their deep faithfulness for just repeating the same old models but with more intensity. They confuse the unchanging heart of their mission with the often very outdated form it took in a totally different era.
And the world we're all operating in now,
Mm-hmm.
it actively punishes that kind of rigidity. I mean, we are not in a stable environment.
Not at all.
You're facing cultural pluralism, these huge generational shifts, political volatility. So if your strategy is static, if it's fixed, our sources show it doesn't just get less effective, it fails decisively.
And that's the tragedy of it, because the failure almost never comes from a lack of commitment. It really doesn't. It comes from a lack of what you could call adaptive wisdom. These methods just harden into tradition, and leaders start to see adapting as, a compromise instead of a core discipline.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack adaptive strategy, or what the sources call AQ. This is really about how you hold on to unchanging truth while navigating a world that, frankly, refuses to stand still.
And this isn't just some trendy management technique. The source material frames it as a deeply theological, missional discipline. We're going to anchor this whole idea in what we can call God's ultimate adaptive act, look at the real costs of getting this wrong, and then walk you through 4 really practical pathways that adaptive leaders use to keep going through the chaos.
Okay, that's a pretty bold place to start. If we're saying adaptation isn't compromise, where do we root that idea theologically? Because I think for a lot of people, the word adaptation in a mission context, it makes them nervous.
It does. And what's so fascinating here is that the ability to adapt isn't some concession to, modernity. Our sources argue it's actually a return to the very heart of the gospel. The big aha moment here is that adaptability is profoundly biblical.
And the ultimate blueprint for that, according to the research, is the Incarnation itself.
Absolutely. The Incarnation is God's original adaptive strategy. I mean, just think about that statement in John 1:14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
He didn't just send a mendo.
He didn't. He didn't demand that humanity culturally ascend to him. He didn't say, first you must learn Greek and adopt Roman customs and then I'll talk to you. He descended.
That reframes strategy in such a powerful way. It's about proximity, not dominance. He didn't stay distant and abstract. He got specific.
Completely. He became fully immersed. He learned the rhythm of human life, spoke a very local language, Aramaic, and revealed this eternal truth through contextual physical presence. This wasn't just some tactical tweak. This was divine world-altering strategy.
So if the unchanging God had to profoundly adapt his method to reach us,
then any mission that wants to endure has to imitate that same movement. It has to.
and that hits hard. Because you connect that to the big picture, it means leaders who cling to fixed models, especially models from totally different contexts, they risk being seen as disconnected, not as faithful.
They risk their own credibility. If your methods, the way you spend money, use buildings, the cultural forms you impose, if they communicate distance and historical dominance, they are actively working against the message of God who chose radical proximity. That's the friction. That's where the failure comes from.
Okay, so if the Incarnation is the ultimate principle, the Apostle Paul is where we see it in motion. He's the model of this courageous flexibility.
Precisely. He understood this tension so deeply. He had conviction without being rigid, clarity without needing control. When he writes that famous line, he says, "He became all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some."
But that line is so often read as, cheap relativism, like Paul just changed his beliefs depending on the room he was in. How do our sources draw that line between true discernment and just being an opportunist?
It's all rooted in his theological clarity. He trusted the core message of the gospel so completely that he was secure enough to let it take local shape. His entire strategy was built on being able to distinguish between the unchanging gospel truth, the essence, and the changing forms, the methods used to communicate it.
And there's this fantastic case study that shows his precision on this his decisions about two of his partners, Timothy and Titus. Let's start with Timothy.
Right, so Timothy had a Jewish mother. When Paul was getting him ready for ministry in largely Jewish areas, he circumcised him. Now, that's a huge cultural move.
A massive hurdle. Why do it?
To remove an unnecessary barrier. It basically communicated, I see your culture, I respect your heritage, and you don't have to reject it to hear this message. He adapted the method to open a door for the mission.
Okay, so method adapted for access. But then you have Titus, who was a Greek Gentile.
And with Titus, Paul adamantly refused to circumcise him. Because in that context, forcing Titus to conform culturally would have implied that, works or your ethnic identity were required for salvation. And that would have compromised the core truth.
That's it. That's the aha moment for you, the learner.
Exactly.
This is an inconsistency. It's profound discernment. Paul never, ever altered his mission-saving sum, but he constantly adapted his methods based on whether the action would serve the gospel or compromise it.
And that ability to discern, that's where adaptive strategy lives. And when we fail at that, when we confuse the truth with the forms, the costs are, they're concrete and they're devastating.
The sources point to 3 specific costs of this rigidity you really need to watch for. First, rigid strategies create dependency, not discipleship.
This is huge. It happens when the mission model is tied so tightly to an imported culture or an outside resource like foreign funding or a building designed for a 1950s suburb that the local community never actually learns to own it.
So when the outside help disappears,
The whole thing collapses. Because it was never truly localized, it was dependent.
Okay, second cost. Fixed models often foster resistance, not receptivity.
Yes. If your inherited methods, say a specific way you run meetings or a certain style of music, if that communicates control instead of humility to a younger generation or a new demographic, they're going to push back. And they're not pushing back against the message, but against the messenger's lack of attention.
Which leads right into the third cost. They communicate dominance instead of humility.
Exactly. I mean, if you insist on preserving every single old structure, no matter how ineffective it is today, you're essentially saying the past method is more important than the present people. And the result is, less impact, eroded credibility. The message is still powerful, but the witnesses have lost their ability to listen.
That's a critical distinction. It means you have to build a new mindset, one that sees change not as a threat, but as the very arena where your faithfulness is proven.
It requires building new muscles, which I think is a good transition into the framework. The 4 practical pathways that really define this adaptive mindset. If AQ requires humility and imagination, what practices actually make that happen?
Okay, let's get into it. The first pathway is all about posture. It's called contextual listening.
Adaptive mission absolutely has to begin with cultural humility. It means learning before you lead and listening before you speak. It sounds so simple, but it's the step everyone wants to skip.
Right, you want to jump to the solution.
We all do, but it's about being a student of your context first, understanding the specific hopes, the fears, the language of the people you're actually there to serve.
And I think that really shifts the core leadership question, doesn't it? It moves from how do we protect our message from this culture to something more like how do we embody this message more faithfully right here with these people right now?
That's the incarnational question. And it leads to the second discipline, which flows right from that listening. And that is building in discernment rhythms. Adaptive leaders don't just react impulsively. They respond prayerfully.
And the classic biblical example of this is the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, right? They had this massive adaptive challenge.
A huge one. How do we include Gentiles without destroying the Jewish identity of the faith? They couldn't just look up the answer in an old rule book.
So what did they do?
They sat in the tension. They didn't rush it. They listened to testimony to what the Spirit was already doing out there. They debated honestly. They weighed tradition against what was new, and they sought guidance together. That intentional pause, that's the rhythm of discernment that AQ demands.
It's the difference between reacting to a crisis and responding with wisdom. Okay, so pathway 3 is about preparation, scenario planning.
Yes. Adaptive strategy requires anticipation, not prediction. We can't know the future, but we can prepare for possibilities. Too often, we build our entire strategy around one single hoped-for outcome.
Which leaves you totally exposed if anything else happens.
Completely. So instead you ask, what are the 3 most disruptive things that could happen in the next 5 years? A major political shift, a funding source dries up, a huge demographic change. And you actually rehearse your responses for each of those scenarios.
The biblical parallel here is Joseph in Genesis, isn't it?
It's perfect. He didn't just predict a famine, he interpreted the dream 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and then it built a massive logistical system to prepare the nation for the certainty of uncertainty. That's strategic foresight.
Faithful stewardship, being ready for the storm. Okay, and that brings us to the fourth and final discipline, iterative strategy review. This is about acknowledging that any strategy is, well, provisional.
It's a working hypothesis, not a sacred text. Adaptive leaders have to build rhythms of reflection into their practice. And they have to ask not just what worked, but why it worked. And crucially, at what cost.
That cost analysis is so important because a success can easily mask a deeper problem.
Oh, absolutely. Did we hit our goal, but in the process, we created dependency or alienated a key group? If the method worked, but it damaged our credibility, then it wasn't a sustainable strategy. This learning cycle just ensures you're constantly aligning your purpose with your practice.
So to pull all this together, adaptive strategy, this AQ, is really a spiritual discipline. It means you have to be anchored enough in your core truth to feel safe adapting, humble enough to learn, and secure enough to actually listen.
Faithful flexibility isn't compromise, it's maturity. The world you're operating in is never going to be stable again. Rigidity won't sustain the mission you care about. We have to embrace that paradox. True faithfulness is expressed in movement, not in being immobile.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to take with you this week. What if the most faithful thing you could possibly do in this season is not to defend your current strategy, but to be courageous enough to let it be refined?
Because the future belongs not to those with the most polished inherited models, but to those who are willing to learn, to listen, and to incarnate anew right where they are. Thank you for diving deep with us today.